Welcome to Norris McLaughlin's Aging Answers, a limited podcast series discussing the key topics of elder law planning and long-term care. I'm your host, Shana Siegel, practice group leader of the Elder Law Group and member at Norris McLaughlin. So today I wanted to talk about Medicaid because we've seen so much talk in the news about potential cuts, federal cuts to programs, and they're really starting to talk about cuts to Medicaid. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the program. So I wanted to talk about Medicaid and how it impacts seniors and how potentially what would happen with cuts to this program. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Medicaid program and really about the coverage of long-term care services in general. A lot of people don't understand until they need long-term care that long-term care is generally not covered under Medicare. It is predominantly covered through private pay and Medicaid. And so if individuals are in the need of an aide to come into the home to provide services for them, to help them with dressing and bathing and eating and all of those things, they're either going to pay for that privately or ultimately they're going to look to Medicaid for that coverage. The same would be true for an individual who needs those services in an assisted living facility or in a skilled nursing home. Like I said, a lot of people think that Medicare provides that service, but the Medicare coverage is extremely limited. So if I were to break a hip and I had that fixed and then I needed some care short term, I was in a rehab facility, Medicare might cover, 20 days, maybe a little bit longer, up to, a potential of 100, but we're generally not actually seeing 100 days of coverage. But if that need continues, if I don't recover, then I would be in a scenario where I'm going to switch over to Medicaid or switch over to private pay. So when we're thinking about long-term care and Medicaid, it's important to realize that this is a program that is predominantly for individuals of limited financial means. However, because long-term care is so very expensive, you see that many individuals who are of middle income, have substantial savings, can ultimately end up on Medicaid just because the expenses are quite so high. Just to give a little bit of a framework for that, we're starting to see that in the New York, New Jersey area, home care is somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 an hour. So, we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars every month. If we're looking at an assisted living facility, we may be looking at care that's anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 a month. And a skilled nursing home is going to be $15,000 to $20,000. Nobody can pay that forever, or at least most of us can't. So that's where the Medicaid program comes in, and it really keeps us from seeing people being completely impoverished by the cost of care. And one of the things that I see very often is I'll have spouses come to me. One spouse has a new diagnosis. They've been diagnosed with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or some other serious condition that is going to result in them needing long-term care for a substantial period of time. And the healthier spouse is very concerned about what's going to happen to them in terms of, how is that care going to be paid for and what's that going to mean for the other spouse in terms of their living expenses. Fortunately, I can provide them with some good news as of today because there are spousal protections built into the Medicaid system, and there are ways for us to, if we plan ahead early enough, to enhance the protections for those communities, for those spouses. So let's kind of understand the basics of Medicaid, and then we can talk about how we can protect spouses and other family members. So the basics of Medicaid is that an individual is eligible for Medicaid if they have assets that are below $2,000 in their name. In New Jersey, some of the other states that we work in, it's a little bit more. Now, the spouse can have more assets than that. The spouse can have assets up to over even $150,000 in their name, a little bit over that. But that is based on if the couple had more than double that at the time that they were first looking at institutional care. So if you had a couple that had $300,000, the spouse would be able to keep half of that, 150, and then you would have the other spouse being able to keep just 2,000, the one who's going on Medicaid. But if the couple had $1 million, that healthy spouse is still limited to that around $150,000 number. So in that situation, you can see, nobody's going to be wanting to retire or live for many years on $150,000. So that's where some of the other rules come in terms of protecting the community spouse. And I use that phrase community spouse because thinking if the other spouse, the Medicaid applicant spouse, goes into a facility, the other spouse is staying in the community. So we use that term, community spouse. One good piece of information is that healthy spouse is able to keep as much income as they want. So if they're working, they can continue to work, and that's not going to keep their spouse from getting Medicaid. Their income is completely protected. Typically, though, we're not having spouses that are working, right? Typically, we're talking about older adults. They're both retired. And in that situation, the healthy spouse can keep their own income, and they may be entitled to some of their spouse's income. So, for instance, if you had a spouse who's ill and they've got a pension and Social Security, and maybe they've got about $5,000 coming in, and then the other spouse who's healthier has another, couple $1,000s. Some of that higher income can be given over to the community spouse to make sure that they still are able to kind of, maintain their lifestyle in the community. And there's a whole formula for how much they're allowed to keep. And so we'll work with couples in order to try and maximize the amount of income that the healthy spouse is allowed to keep. Many people don't understand that they could be eligible for Medicaid because they think, oh, well, my income is very high, and they think it's only a very low income. But that's actually not true. I have individuals who go on Medicaid even though they may have, $5,000, $6,000 of income, because the cost of care is so high that the cost of care is going to exceed that income that's coming in. So there may be some extra steps that we have to take in order to make the individual eligible, but they can ultimately be eligible for Medicaid and have Medicaid pay the difference between what the facility charges and what their income is. Medicaid can cover that piece of it. So it can be really, really important when you're thinking about, how are we going to qualify for Medicaid, that, you can really be eligible even though you have, might have substantial assets at one point and then, have substantial income, that ultimately that doesn't mean you would never be eligible for Medicaid. A counter to that is sometimes people think, oh, well, I don't have a lot of assets, so can just go on to Medicaid. But Medicaid also has medical requirements. And I have this all the time. When clients come to me and they say, okay, well, I'm going to go on to Medicaid, and they're in assisted living. And I'll say, okay, great. Well, what care do you need? And they say, well, I don't really need that much. I'm in the assisted living, and they help me, with my medications, or, they provide meals, but, I basically care for myself. Then you're not going to be eligible for Medicaid because it's a medical-based program. So you need to require medical assistance. In fact, you have to require assistance with 3 of your basic activities of daily living. So, it's a fairly high standard to medically qualify for this Medicaid program, which covers long-term care services and supports. So it's important to think about both the medical piece as well as the financial piece. When we're thinking about whether an individual is eligible, and we'll go back to the couple, and we have a couple, and they're concerned about how to protect the healthy spouse, and how, if it's the wife who's going to be remaining in the home, how she is going to be able to pay for things. First thing is, a lot of people think, oh, they're going to take my house. Well, that's not true. The house is going to be an exempt asset, And if that is transferred solely into the healthy spouse's name, then there's no lien. She could sell that house later at any point, and that is a completely protected asset. So you don't really have to worry about that. Likewise, a car is a protected asset. Tangible things in the house, Medicaid is not really looking at. But they are going to be looking at all of your other financial assets. So that might be a life insurance policy. If it's a policy that has a cash value, then that's going to be considered an available resource, and it would have to be spent before you're Medicaid eligible. Similarly, if you had stocks or annuities or any other asset that can be converted to cash, those are all things that have to be spent down before you would be Medicaid eligible. You're only allowed to have one house, not a second house. So there's a lot of rules that people have to understand in order to think about whether or not they are eligible or could ultimately in the future be eligible for Medicaid. And, there's a lot of planning that can go in to allow somebody who is, kind of middle income, some, maybe substantial retirement savings to be able to be eligible for Medicaid without completely impoverishing that spouse, without that spouse having to only, envision living on $150,000 for the rest of their life. There are specialized annuity products. There are other asset preservation strategies that can be put in place to potentially really allow that healthy spouse to be protected and to be able to make sure that, they can have the funds that they need to be able to continue their lifestyle while their spouse who needs care is able to get the care that they need. So a lot of things to really think about when we're looking at Medicaid planning. And the earlier we can plan for it, the more options that are going to be available. So what if we're not talking about a spousal situation? A lot of times I'll have adult children come to me and they're concerned that their parent is maybe needing Medicaid and they made gifts or they want to make gifts and they want to make sure that, assets are available for their children. They want to leave a legacy. Medicaid, because it is a program for individuals with limited means, they will look back at any gifts to see if any gifts were given within the last 5 years. So you can't have a diagnosis, realize that you're going to need long-term care services, and all of a sudden give away $1 million and go on to Medicaid. Medicaid will look back for any transactions that occurred within the last 5 years. So I mention that because recently I had a client come to me and she said, I don't understand. Why are they asking all of these questions? Who cares what I did with my money? It was my money. I should be allowed to spend it. And I totally get that. We all work hard for our money and we want to spend it, and it's our business how we spend it. But from a Medicaid perspective, they're looking for those people who would give away money and then try to become eligible for Medicaid. So for that reason, they're looking at financial transactions going back 5 years from the date of application. And that may mean that if there was a gift to a grandchild for their wedding or, for someone in the family to take a trip, or somebody lost a job and, help them out for a little period, that those things are all going to be looked at. And potentially there will be a penalty that will result in you not being eligible for Medicaid for a period of time. So a lot of times people come to me and they say, well, I'm concerned about my family member who's maybe starting to show some signs of dementia, and they've been helping out a member of the family. There's a member of the family who's been out of work, and my mom has been giving them money for a period of time. And they want to stop that. And one of the things that I really will explain to that family is how important it is to stop it, because if you don't, that will cause a problem when it comes the time for Medicaid. Because what the Medicaid caseworker is going to do is they're going to look at all those records for 5 years and they're going to add up all those gifts and they're going to say, look, they were giving $1,500 to their child every single month for, 3 years. And all of that money, it now is either has to be given back, which that child probably doesn't have the money to give it back, or the individual is going to be ineligible for a period of time for Medicaid. They're going to add up the gifts, and if it was, $50,000, that's 5 months that they're not going to get Medicaid when they would otherwise be eligible. There are things that we can do to plan for that if we get involved soon enough. So if you do have those kinds of potential scenarios, it's really important to address them sooner rather than later, because we can cure those type of gifts. We can overcome it, but you really have to get ahead of the game and know about those before you submit the Medicaid application and before the rest of the money is spent down. There can be situations where we can say, that gift can be exempted. There are certain situations where it's okay to give a gift. Give a gift to an individual with a disability. You can give a gift between spouses. So there are some scenarios that are allowable, but again, you would really want to know about that and figure that out ahead of time. Biggest question people have when they're thinking about long-term care and looking into the future is, how do I protect my house, right? Our house is our biggest asset for many of us. And so people think, is the state just going to take my house? Well, as I said before, the house is going to be protected for the spouse. If the individual going on Medicaid has a minor child, that minor child can live in that house and it can be protected for them. It can also be transferred to a disabled child, an individual who is the child of the Medicaid applicant who has a disability. There are a couple of other exceptions related to the house. So one is a sibling with an equity interest. So, I have some clients, it's 2 sisters who live in a house together. One of them became ill, needed Medicaid, and we were able to transfer that property over to the other sister under this exception for siblings with an equity interest. Similarly, there's an exception for a child who is a caregiver who moves into the house and provides care in that home for the parent for a period of 2 years. There's a lot of rules that relate to that particular exception and how it works and how much care the person has to need and how much care the child has to provide and all of that. But, that is a possibility as well to protect the home. So something to really think about if it could potentially apply to you. And of course, if we're going to think ahead of time, if we have the luxury of thinking 5 years ahead of needed Medicaid, then we could potentially protect assets from Medicaid and transfer them, wait the 5 years, and then apply for Medicaid. So the earlier you know about all of these issues, the more likely you are to be able to protect assets. Even when we don't have 5 years, depending on what the assets look like, how much there is left, we may still be able to protect some assets for children or other family members that the Medicaid applicant wants to give to. So I'd always say, think ahead if you can. Understand Medicaid and how it works. Also important to understand how Medicaid interplays with other programs like veterans benefits if the applicant was a veteran or a spouse of a veteran. Understanding the importance of really what facilities require. In terms of some facilities require a private pay period, so you can't spend all your money and then want to apply for Medicaid and go into a facility. Most facilities won't take someone Medicaid direct. They want someone who can pay for a bit. So it's really important to, if you do get a diagnosis and Medicaid might be in your future, to really see someone who can guide you in this area, because there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of misunderstandings, and you don't want to make a misstep. So I hope this was helpful. I hope that you understand how important Medicaid is for seniors, what it would mean if seniors lost this benefit, because it, is the primary payer for long-term care in our country, and that you'll share that information and plan ahead if Medicaid is ever a possibility for you. This has been Norris McLaughlin's Aging Answers, a limited podcast series discussing the key topics revolving around elder law planning and long-term care. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode, and if you'd like to learn more about our work, please email me at aginganswers@norris-law.com.